I currently work as a cop in a pretty small town. It's surrounded by woods and parks. The forests are not part of any national park system, but I feel as if it's as big as one. I have to be vague about the area because I don't think my boss would appreciate me talking about this case. It's still pretty big news considering nothing ever happens in this area. When a child goes missing in the woods, it should be big news. When two goes missing, it's more than news. I never told anyone the truth about what happened in those woods when I took a day looking for those children. I'm certain that if my boss heard any of this, he would strip me of my badge and send me off to a head doctor. But I have to tell this in hopes I get any information about who I came across that day. I had an early midlife crisis and changed careers. I come from a long line of police officers and had planned that to be my future, but because of some complicated and boring reasons I choose to do something else. Then, later on in life, I regretted my choices and did what I needed to do to become a cop. Even though I looked on the older side, I didn't actually have a lot of experience in law enforcement. The place that hired me didn't need someone who did, just a person that looked the part. Nothing happened in this small town, just some easy to break up bar brawls. Hell, they couldn't even be called brawls. I feel as if they only hired me so I could go through their ancient filing system and update it because my boss refused to do it. While I was organizing the mountain of old paperwork and cases, I found out this town had a pretty regular pattern of hikers going missing on the trails. But after looking at the national average, I guessed our town wasn't anything special. Nothing sinister going on. People just get lost. I had only been working at my new job for 6 months when the uproar started. A child had gone missing on one of the easier short hiking trails with his family. His father had turned his head to talk to his wife, and when he looked back, his little boy was gone. They had thought he had just ducked behind a tree to scare them, but after looking through the entire area, they grew panicked. The mother stayed where they last saw him, and the father ran to get help by the ranger station. They quickly organized a search for the boy. The mother stayed in that spot for nearly 10 hours waiting and watching, not knowing what else to do. I'm not a hiker myself, but I joined the volunteers and searched for the boy. Any spare moment I had, I was doing whatever I could to help. I ended up with hundreds of bug bites and torn ankles from my new boots, but I never complained. A child was out in the woods and we couldn't find any trace of him. Then a girl was lost. She was a classmate of the boy and wanted to help. Some volunteers humored her and let her run water to people searching, but she could only go a few feet into the woods. If she saw someone coming near the trail end, she would run up to give them a cold water bottle. She was in sight the entire time. Again, someone turned their head as she took a step onto the trail, and when they turned back, she was gone. The people who she had been walking towards hadn't turned their heads. They were completely bewildered and questioned what they had seen. She simply was gone in a blink of an eye. No one had a logical reason for it, so they didn't dwell on how the children disappeared, only that they now had 2 missing. Helicopters came and sent dogs joined the search, but after a week the search was trying to recover a body. 2 children under the age of 10 in the woods for that long wasn't likely to last. I had been doing whatever I could in those days, but felt useless. My boss noticed how badly this case was on my health and forced me to take 1 day off. After all, I wasn't a hiker or an expert in cases like these. I had done everything I could, and if I kept hiking, I would burn myself out. He felt like there was more than enough people looking. I could rest for a day and then got back at it full force. I did not listen to him. I did go to bed early the night before so I could be up at the crack of dawn to go back on the trails. I wasn't a part of the volunteer teams and my boss told them I shouldn't be out there. They gave me some looks but let me go hiking as long as I promised to stay on the short trails and not go into the woods, which I agreed. I could get lost and that wouldn't help anyone. I knew I wouldn't find any traces of the children on a trail that had been looked over at least 100 times before, but I still couldn't just stay at home. That's how I spent my free day, hiking trails and getting more blisters on my ankles. I had a backpack of some supplies. Even though I had hiked for the entire day, I wasn't very hungry. I think the stress stress was getting to me. I still had some water and granola bars in my pack near the end of the day. I was in the middle of a somewhat longer trail I had gotten permission to search on when the sun had started to set. I decided to start heading back but knew it would be dark by the time I arrived at the end of the trail into the ranger's station in the front of the woods. I knew I wasn't going to find anything, but I still felt disappointed ending the day empty-handed. The orange light of the sun had faded into a gray light, a strange gray light that made bright colors pop. I had forgotten how strange that time of day looked. My orange shirt nearly looked neon in the gray light. Because of the odd light, I saw a bright white on the trail easier than I might have at a different time of the day. The trail had a slope to it. I had just reached the top ready to go down when I saw the white on the trail. I squinted to see a person standing wearing a long white and baggy sweater. The day had been hot and not at all sweater weather. The person was short and my heart started to race, but this person didn't look short enough to be 7. But it was still very strange to see a preteen just standing in the middle of the trail. I went down the slope and towards them hoping I looked friendly and they didn't book it into the woods. "Hey, are you alright?" I asked when I was a few steps away from them. At first, I thought they had been wearing a long white hat of some sort, but when I got closer, I saw their hair was pure white. This was a very short older person, or this child dyed their hair. I noticed they weren't wearing any shoes and found that strange. Their feet weren't dirty from walking in the woods, and I didn't see any abandoned shoes around the trail. I had no idea how they went bare feet without tearing up their soles. Hearing my voice, they turned to face me. They were a child like I had first thought. Their hair fell over their face, making it hard to see their face. I guess they were a boy, even if they had hair on the longer side. Alarm bells were ringing just in the back of my head, but I couldn't ignore a lost child in the middle of the woods. "I'm a cop, you're safe. My name is Hugh." I was carrying my badge in my backpack and held it out for the boy to see. The boy still hadn't spoken or reacted in the slightest, but at least he was looking at me, showing he was listening. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" I asked as gently as I could. I couldn't blame the boy for being scared of a random man coming up to him in the woods. I hoped he trusted me enough to bring him to the ranger station so we could get help. We had to find out where the boy's family were and make sure he wasn't in any kind of trouble. Protective instincts I didn't even know I had was kicking in. I wanted to carry him out of the woods to make sure he wouldn't hurt his feet walking, but getting any answer from the kid would be a win. Best not to make him too uncomfortable. He hadn't responded to any of my questions, so I got down on his level to keep trying. "What's your name?" "Ellie." I finally got something out of him. His voice was so soft I could barely hear it. But I had a name. "I'm going to the ranger station. How about you come with me? If you feel comfortable with it, we could hold hands so we don't get lost." I saw his hands fidget a little at the end of his large sweater as his eyes darted back and forth considering what I had asked. Because I had gotten down a bit lower, I could see his eyes through his white hair. His hair wasn't dyed. He was albino, judging by his pink-reddish eyes, a rare condition I had never seen in person before. I heard people with the condition had bad eyesight. It would be dark soon and I was surprised there was still light after how long we spoke for. Holding hands would be a good idea if he couldn't see when the sun did finally set. He came to a decision and held out his hand to let me take it. He seemed like a shy kid, so I didn't push any more conversation and took my small win. When we started to walk, I kept an eye on the ground, making sure I was guiding him away from anything that might harm his feet. I wish I had brought a pair of extra socks that day. Ellie was very light-footed though, he carefully walking around twigs on tiptoes as if it was second nature to him. I remember not wearing shoes as a child, so maybe he had just adjusted without them. I wished I had a way to leave a note where I found him. If his parents were nearby, they would be worried, but I assumed they would go where we were headed once they couldn't find him. I had my phone on me and I was glad it still had a charge. Still holding Ellie's hand, I tried to unlock my phone with one hand. It had frozen, which I thought was weird. It had never frozen before. I tried to restart it and my screen came back on, but the clock remained the same time it was when I first checked it. The sun still hadn't set and my phone clock wasn't moving. I wanted to call the station saying I found Ellie, but no matter what I tried, my phone just refused to work. I shoved it into my pocket to try and use it again at a different time. As we walked down a slope, I get hit with deja vu. I thought I had already walked down this slope, In fact, I just found Ellie at the bottom, but I ignored it. The woods all looked the same to me. I could just be getting confused by my surroundings in the dark. I was never a good hiker, but when we hiked up another slope and came down again, I was seriously starting to think a tree growing on top of a boulder was the same one we had just passed by. My throat was starting to get dry, and panic was rising in my chest. Why did everything look the same? Why had the sun not set yet? And why would my phone clock not move? I pushed those worries down until we passed by the same tree growing on top of the boulder a third time. I didn't want to stress out Ellie, who had silently been walking beside me the entire time. Ellie, could you do me a favor? I don't mean to worry you, but could you stand right here as I look over that slope ahead of us? I just want to look ahead. I swear I won't leave you. The boy gave me a nod, and it looked like he didn't want to let go of my hand. But he let it go, and I half jogged up the trail to the small hill in front of us. When I started to walk away, Ellie had crouched over and started to shove sticks in the dirt. When I saw at the top of the hill, it gave me tunnel vision. I thought I was going to faint. I stood staring at Ellie crouched over playing with sticks. I looked behind me and saw the same thing. This couldn't be happening. I had to be seeing things. Maybe Ellie had a twin and they were messing with me. I jogged down and walked over to the tree I was using as a landmark. I put my useless phone on top of a root. Ellie was staring at me and I gave him a smile. "Humor me," I told him, and started up the slope again. When I reached the top, Ellie still had his line of sticks, but I felt a weight in my pocket. My phone was no longer on the tree root. It had returned to my pocket. What the hell? I asked slowly to myself. I had to be going crazy. Maybe the stress had finally gotten to me. I couldn't be stuck in a loop. These things just didn't happen. I walked down and stopped in front of Ellie, wondering what my face looked like in that moment. If this was really happening, then Ellie might know something. After all, when I found him, the loop started. But I wasn't ready to put any blame on him yet. "I'm going to climb a tree," I said, hands on my hips. A hint of a smile flickered on Ellie's face. I had no idea what else to do. Clearly, I couldn't walk along the trail without getting brought back. But I wasn't about to risk going into the woods. I would get put back on the trail or get lost in the trees. Maybe, just maybe, if I climbed high enough, I could see something interesting. Or maybe the loop didn't reach high in the air. It was something I could try. I placed my bag at the base of the boulder tree and started to climb. "Watch my bag for me, champ. You can have the water and snacks if you want though," I told Ellie and started to climb. I wasn't much for climbing, but the branches were thick and close together, so it made it easy. This tree was almost made for it. I slowly made my way up, getting covered in leaves, sap, and scratches from the bark. I didn't know when I should stop. I made the mistake of looking down and froze in fear for a few seconds. I learned in that moment I was afraid of heights, but I had to keep going. I had to get out of there and find a way to get Ellie out of the woods. I don't know how long it took, but I made it nearly to the top, and where I could no longer grab branches to support my weight. I looked around, seeing nothing special, but I was still in the tree, so maybe the loop didn't reach that high. I took a risk and climbed one more branch when the world went dark. I realized that the sun had set in a blink of an eye. I looked up at a starry sky through the branches before an immense force suddenly knocked me from my perch. It felt like an invisible hand had grabbed around me and plowed my body through all the branches I had just climbed. The pain was nothing I had ever felt before. I heard my legs break before I felt it. My ribs were crushed and a knock to my skull, thankfully making my world dark. When I woke up, I was on the bottom of the trail right next to Ellie, who I'm pretty sure just was poking me with a stick. I screamed, sitting up, patting my body, looking for what was broken, only to find myself in one piece. I was breathing hard, looking frantically around to see I was back in the gray light of the trail, and my body healed. Not even the tree sap remained. "I guess that didn't work," I said with a small laugh, enough though I wanted to cry. My body was healed, but I still held that memory of the pain. It was a good idea. I don't think I've ever seen someone find an opening of the loop before, Ellie commented in his small, soft voice. He had spoken about the loop. I no longer could doubt it was happening. The whole thing was now in the open, and we needed to talk about it. "I'm stuck in a loop," I said slowly, still not fully believing it. "Yes, you are," Ellie said with a nod. He was making doodles in the dirt with his stick, as if the strangest thing wasn't happening. Like all of this was normal. I stared at him and the sticks he had placed in a circle in the dirt, and a thought suddenly came to me. "I'm stuck, but you're not. The sticks Ellie had been playing with remained when my phone was returned. It may have been because Ellie hadn't moved, but his wording made me clue in. He didn't agree we were both stuck. Just myself. I pulled my pack next to him and patted on it, giving him a place to comfortably sit. "Alright, champ. Take a seat, and let's figure out what's going on. With both of us in unlimited time, I'm sure we can figure out why this is happening. You're not going to accuse me of trapping you," Ellie said, and the surprised tone in his voice was the most emotion he showed since we met. "Nope, you don't seem the type." I could have sworn I saw his ears turn a little red through his hair. He sat on my backpack, knees tucked inside his sweater, making him look very small. But for the small child he was, I knew in that moment he might not be human. But lucky for myself, he had the answers to what was going on. Humans are born to die. Most creatures are. You can't understand endless existence. Not truly understand it. If you did, you would become something else. That is the purpose of this loop. For you to become something else. In this place, you cannot die. You just remain, for your mind to rot or turn. The one that created this place reproduces this way. If your mind turns and you become something else, it twists your flesh into something the same as itself. The ones who cannot make the change are eaten. The loop keeps the victims fresh. I assume the missing children on the trail were taken for food. Children don't often manage the change. I got goosebumps listening to Ellie's words. I hated the idea of those two kids being trapped the way I was, stuck in a forever loop, not understanding what was happening and not being able to get out. I was lucky enough to come across someone to explain things to me. Ellie kept talking, so I pushed my thoughts aside to listen. Humans cannot break this loop. I am not human, so I cannot be trapped here, but I cannot break this loop to save you. It goes against what I am. I cannot save a human from a creature of the night. I, however, can make this offer to you once. I can turn you into something else. Once you come to my side, I can save you. I can remove you from these woods. I cannot guarantee your humanity though. You may end up as something far worse than the creature that has trapped you here. Ellie stared at me so intensely with his red eyes. It felt like the forest was closing in on me, waiting to hear my answer. I could either become a creature after suffering through an endless amount of time, or take him up on his offer and become something else, or take a huge risk. "No thank you," I said with a small smile. To my surprise, Ellie smiled back. A small one, but still a smile. I knew he wasn't going to offer to turn me again, but I also knew Ellie was here for a reason. Maybe that reason would get me out of this mess. It's best for you to stay silent as I take care of why I came here. I cannot promise your life. I need to summon the creature who made this loop and speak with it. It could eat you, Ellie said as he stood up. I watched him as he walked to the middle of the trail. He stood waiting for me to nod and give him a small wave, telling him I was ready to maybe die in the next few minutes. Not much else I could do about it. He gave me a nod back, then stomped down hard on the dirt-packed ground. I thought I heard some sort of hollow echo and the faintest silver light coming from him when he stomped. My body sensed the creature before I saw it. Every hair on the back of my neck stood on end and my hands started to shake. I had never been so scared in my life. I would honestly rather be thrown from a tree 100 times than be sitting on the trail when the creature showed itself. It was an enormous black mass that flickered through the trees like a ghost. Its white glowing eyes and clawed black hands looked solid enough though. Wrapping one hand around a tree, it looked so big it could easily rip that tree from the roots. Even though it was massive, its voice was barely a whisper. It was right in front of us and yet I could barely get a good look. It was like my eyes refused to focus on the thing, and I was glad for that. What creature has wandered into my forest? It reached out a large claw towards Ellie, who stood firm. Even in my state, I wanted to run out and protect him. The claw stopped right in front of his face when Ellie started to speak. "You have created for too many children. Your limit was 2. You are taking too many humans to feed them, and I suspect you took this other human to create a new." Ellie's strong words were cut off by a rasping laugh from the woods that made my skin crawl. "This forest is mine. I can make as many children as I like. Now be gone." The massive claw came down to crush poor little Ellie, and I shot to my feet. I was far too slow, but my concern was not needed. The moment the ghastly claw came down, it exploded in a silver mist. The creature let out a shriek of pain and darted further back into the woods, nursing its wound. Ellie had not moved and his back was turned to me, but I could feel his was very angry. "You cannot be," the monster hissed with a voice full of hate. The Silver King is dead. I can never die, and you have insulted me beyond going past your child limit. As a punishment, you must kill the most recent ones you have created. You must also break the loops of the humans you have trapped. Humans that are most suited to be returned to their world, adjusted to live peacefully. You'll go hungry for a while, but be thankful for your life. The monster hissed more, darted back and forth between the trees considering what to do. It clearly wanted to kill Ellie, but couldn't. I didn't believe that Ellie, the small child before me, was a scarier monster than the dark thing in the woods. But the proof was the thing not attacking. With more pacing and hateful hissing, it agreed. Oh, thank you, my dear Silver King, for sparing my life this night. I shall never forget it, never. I had never heard such pure hate before. It made me feel sick just listening to that dreadful voice. I had no idea how Ellie stood so still with them directed towards him. He was a tough kid, it seemed. I expected something special to happen, but I just blinked and everything returned to normal. It was dark, meaning the sun had finally set. Ellie stood in the same spot, the monster in the woods gone. I checked my phone, finding it working, but I didn't use it to call for help. I knew I was safe to walk to the end of the trail and out of the woods. Ellie looked at me with a hard-to-read look on his face. It lightened when I offered my hand to him so we could continue the way we had started. Even in the dark, I saw his face flush a little. He was a big, important figure among very scary creatures. I don't think he often was treated like the child he was, and appreciated the gesture. I wish I had spoken to him on our walk. I didn't know what to say after everything I had seen. I was going through ideas in my head when I saw something else on the trail in front of us. My throat closed and I felt tears come to my eyes. The missing children stood alone, holding hands and looking very scared. I let go of Ellie's hand to run over to the poor lost kids. I checked them over, finding them to be safe and perfectly fine. But when I looked back, Ellie was gone. I was a bit suspicious bringing two of the missing kids out of the woods. Two kids that should have been dead and looked the same as they did when they had gone missing. But I had a solid alibi when they had been on the trails. One was me on camera buying gas, and the other was me with 10 other volunteers when the little one had gone missing. Some people thought I was working with the ones who had taken them, but with no proof, the matter dropped. No one could explain what happened, and I was not offering my strange tale. The kids said they had just been stuck in one spot for a long time and didn't get hungry. Since they were so young, the police didn't know what to make of it. The case came to a standstill, but most people were just happy the kids were found. Since then, I wondered about Ellie. I can't help but think how he's doing out there and if he's safe. Of course, he's safe. He seems like a big deal, but I can't help myself. I've been looking, trying to find any mention of him, but so far nothing. If you run into him out there, please trust him and treat him nicely. He has a tough job. And please tell him Hugh says hello and wants to know he's doing okay. I've lived in East Tennessee for most of my life. Growing up, I'd hear old wives' tales and urban legends about strange creatures that roamed the forest. For the longest time, I thought what every other kid thought, that they were stories told to scare kids away from dangerous places so they wouldn't fall into a ravine or get lost in the massive wilderness. I never thought any of it was more than made-up stories. That's not to say I didn't spend my share of time with covers pulled tightly over my head when the wind blew branches against my window that happened to face the woods. As I grew older, I found myself gravitating toward the stories of strange creatures in the woods. That curiosity is what started me to investigate such things in my spare time. People around here seem to be obsessed with Bigfoot, as if he's some local celebrity. They tend to ignore or downplay other cryptids. I don't know why. With the hundreds of thousands of acres of unexplored and barely explored forest, it seems there's lots of space for anything that feels like making its home there and could be left in relative peace. Me, I'm more of a fan of Dogman, unofficially of course. You see, once I graduated high school, my only goal was to become a park ranger. Where else could you go to work and be surrounded by such glorious nature, even at its most dangerous? There are literally dozens of stories I could tell, but the one that sticks with me is the hikers from a couple of years ago. I remember it was early October. I always make the hike up to Klingerman's Dome several times during autumn, gazing out over the canvas of trees spouting a myriad myriad of colors, looking every bit like nature's fireworks show, reinforced that I made the right career choice. I was on patrol when a call came in to go to the cabins near Fontana Lake. I got the address and headed south, crossing into North Carolina. When I got there, I was met by a woman who said her husband, son, and brother-in-law had gone to the lake fishing and hadn't come back. I got the information I needed about their general description, names, and description of the truck and boat, then headed out to search for them. She said they were heading up to Wolf Creek. I called it in and told the station I would be driving down to Flat Branch to see if they went in the river there. It was a decent drive to get there, but then it was a decent drive to get pretty much anywhere out in the backwoods of the Smoky Mountains. When I got there, I found 3 trucks parked off to the side. 2 of them had empty boat trailers. I checked the description the wife had given me and it matched one of the trucks. I had a beginning point for my search. I walked up to the water and looked both ways, hoping to luck out and find them coming in from a hard day's fishing. No such luck. There was a house nearby, so I walked over and asked if they had seen my quarry. The man said he had been out fishing himself yesterday and recalled seeing a boat like the one I described with 2 men and a boy in it. I asked him which direction they were going and he said west. I asked if he had a boat and could take me up to Wolf Creek. The man's demeanor changed from friendly to deadly quiet. He agreed to take me across the river, but not all the way to Wolf Creek. I accepted what I could get. After a quick jog back to my truck to get my backpack, he ferried me across and quickly left. It was a mile or so to the rural campsite I suspected they had camped at. I started walking along the edge of the river, keeping an eye out for them. It wasn't long until I spotted a boat sitting on the shore. I approached the boat, and it seemed to be the right one. Everything about this missing persons report seemed like just someone who stayed out later than planned. It was a little too easy. I would be very happy to find them sitting by a campfire about to pack up and go home. It didn't take long to hike to the campsite, but when I got there things stopped being easy. There were only 2 tents set up, but they both looked like someone or something had torn into them. I checked inside each one and found sleeping bags and general camp equipment strewn about. I did my best not to disturb anything. When I came to the second tent, I found something more disturbing. This tent was also in disarray, but as I looked I saw distinct drops of red. There was a notebook sitting near one of the sleeping bags. I picked it up and paged through it. October 3rd. We headed out for our annual fishing trip this morning. Mom wasn't too happy, but we told her we'd be back tomorrow. The drive to the boat launch was kinda long, but we filled the time talking about all the fish we were gonna catch and generally telling stories about the area. Dad tried to scare me with a story about a cryptid that lives in the area, but I knew he was just yanking my chain. We got to the boat launch and headed out into the water without too much of a hitch. Uncle Roger nearly fell in, trying to get the boat undone. He didn't find it nearly as funny as Dad and I did. Once we were out on the lake and had our lines in the water, he seemed to settle in and enjoy himself. After a few beers, he was laughing about it with us. We caught a couple of fish, but they were too small, and we had to throw them back. Dad said he'd heard about a good spot up by Wolf Creek. We had better luck when we got there. Uncle Roger caught 3 largemouths and I caught 2. Dad had a big one on his line, but it got loose before we could net it. It was starting to get dark, so Dad said we should go to one of the rural campsites. We pulled the boat up to shore and tied it to a large tree, then took our gear and hiked to the campsite. There wasn't anyone else there, which Dad said was odd because the site is normally full. We unpacked and set up our tents, and Dad got a fire going while Uncle Roger cleaned the fish. We ate and laughed and talked until it was dark and we turned in for the evening. Dad said there was a better fishing spot further west, and he wanted to go there early in the morning before we headed back to the cabin. It's the middle of the night and Dad is playing a joke on me. I woke up for some reason and he wasn't in the tent. I could hear rustling outside, along with something pawing the ground and snorting. I knew it was Dad trying to scare me. He and Uncle Roger had been telling cryptid stories while we ate supper. I told them they weren't gonna scare me like they did last year. They just looked at each other and smiled. I knew they would have something up their sleeves. I didn't bother to turn the light on or go out and check. I knew they would just run away and hide, pretending to be a creature I had scared off. Then in the morning, they would ask each other if they heard the commotion, hoping to scare me. I wasn't falling for it. One thing you learn from having a prankster for a dad is not to believe anything you see, or in this case, hear. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but Dad was making it tough. He was stomping and growling around so loud, trying to get my attention, but I wasn't having it. When I got up in the morning and went outside, the camp had been destroyed. Uncle Roger asked if I had heard anything last night, and I played along saying I'd heard some creature outside our tent, but I was too scared to go out and check. He made a good show of searching for Dad and seeming genuinely concerned. I was just waiting for Dad to get tired of the game and come back to the campsite. As the morning wore on, Uncle Roger started talking about going to look for him. I wanted to tell him I hadn't fallen for their little prank but didn't want to spoil their fun. When noon rolled around and Dad wasn't back, I started to get worried. Maybe he had fallen and hit his head on a rock or something. Uncle Roger was beside himself. He told me he would have already gone looking for Dad, but didn't want to leave me alone at the camp. We decided to go look for him. Uncle Roger found what looked like a scuffle and we headed off in that direction. He told me to stay right with him as we struggled through the forest looking for any sign of Dad. I was starting to doubt that this was a prank. I was getting worried about Dad. The further we went, the more I realized how wrong I'd been. I wanted Dad to jump out and scare me just so I'd know he was okay. We walked around for hours searching for him, but we couldn't find him. I was beyond worried now and I could tell Uncle Roger was too, but he didn't let on. He just kept saying Dad was probably already back at the campsite now. When the sun started sinking low in the sky, we gave up our search and headed back. Twice, we lost our way and had to double back to get to the site. There weren't many trails out here, at least not that people had made. When we got back to the site, I ran to our tent, hoping he would be there, but he wasn't. We ate a quick supper and turned in for the night. Uncle Roger promised me he would wake me up when Dad came back. October 4th. Uncle Roger never woke me. Dad didn't come back. I said we should call for help, but he told me Dad had the only phone. We were trying to decide what to do when we heard a rustling in the woods, and the birds went silent. We looked around for the source of the noise, and unfortunately, we found it. There was a thing coming toward us. It stood on its back hind legs and its body made these loud cracking sounds, like its bones were snapping into or out of place, echoing all around us. This thing was huge. I literally froze. My body refused to move as this horror came toward us. Uncle Roger grabbed me and yanked me over behind his tent. We tried to hide, but this thing saw us and let out a massive roar. We were so close I could see blood on its claws and teeth. I prayed it wasn't Dad's. "What do we do?" I said. He put his finger up to his lips. It looked over at us and then went into my tent like it was searching for something. "Come on," Uncle Roger said. We snuck away from the monster as quietly as possible. We slipped down the bank of the creek and walked downstream in the water. "Where are we going?" I whispered. "There's a bridge downstream. If we're quiet enough and that thing loses our scent, we could hide under it and hope it goes away." I focused on walking as quietly as I could through the water. The sound of the creek was loud, so I was hopeful it wouldn't see or hear us. It seemed like forever until we reached the bridge. It was a small, wooden bridge that spanned the creek, allowing hikers to pass over. There wasn't a lot of cover. We tried to wedge ourselves into the shadows at the furthest end of it. Time slowed to a standstill as I sat there on the uncomfortable rocks, shivering. Neither of us had our jackets on, and the sun had gone down, taking the warm air with it. I started to doze when I felt a nudge. I looked up and Uncle Roger was motioning me to be quiet. I was about to ask why when I heard the creak of a board on the bridge right above my head. It wasn't a steady walk of a hiker going down the trail. It was a slow, deliberate step on someone sneaking or hunting. I listened in mortal terror as the board slowly gave way to the weight of whatever was on it. One slow step at a time. As if I wasn't cold enough, my teeth began to chatter with fear. It couldn't have been very loud. Uncle Roger barely heard it and went into silent convulsions, motioning me to stop. I bit my tongue to keep the noise down and continued to listen. Only there was nothing to listen to. Whatever was on the bridge had stopped moving. It was as if it was listening to be sure it had heard something. I strained my ears to listen for any movement. When I did, I heard sniffing. The thing was trying to catch our scent. For the first time, I noticed there was a slight breeze blowing. It was blowing in the same direction the water flowed, but I had no idea which side of the bridge the creature was on. The wind could be our savior or our doom. Another slow footstep sounded like a bomb going off as the board creaked beneath it. For the briefest of moments, it seemed like it was moving away toward the far end of the bridge. I hoped and prayed that was the case as another footstep sounded, then another. I breathed a silent sigh of relief as I heard it step off the edge of the bridge and onto the trail. My relief was short-lived though, as I saw a face peek around the corner and peer under the bridge. I froze in terror as this thing that looked like a giant monstrous dog walking on its hind legs snuck around the corner of the bridge and dipped its feet into the water. It sniffed the air and poked its snout into the shadows under the far side of the bridge. Coming up empty, it turned its focus to the side of the bridge where we were hiding. Daylight had faded to dusk. There was precious little light to see by. That was our only saving grace. The shadows were darker here, making us nearly invisible, but that was rapidly ending as the beast approached. My mind was vapor-locked. I had no clue what to do. Running would just give us away more quickly. It was looking like our only choice was to die. At that moment, I was 100% sure of what had happened to Dad. Hot tears streamed down my cheeks at the thought of my father being torn apart by this monster. As I prepared to die, I felt Uncle Roger lean over a little closer. He was right in front of me, and it was hard to see the monster. I saw his hand move down toward the ground and pick up a stone the size of his fist. I knew right away what was happening. He was trying to shield me. He would offer himself as a sacrifice to protect me. My tears redoubled, making it hard to see. The monster was almost on us. It hadn't acted like it knew we were there, but at this point, it didn't matter. A few more steps, and all doubt would be removed. I saw it reach out with its terrible claws that nearly touched Uncle Roger's nose. This was it. Suddenly it stopped. It lifted its head and sniffed the air. I saw the hair on its back bristle, then in a heartbeat, it disappeared. Uncle Roger slowly stood and looked around. I tried to do the same, but my legs didn't want to cooperate. I dislodged some stones as I stood, making a little noise and causing Uncle Roger to hiss at me. We stood silently waiting for that thing to come jumping out at us from whatever hiding place it was in. After a few minutes, I began to hope that we were okay. Uncle Roger led the way back to our camp. He said we should change into dry clothes and get a little rest. It felt so good to be warm again. I snuggled up in my sleeping bag and wrote this message so that if we don't make it, someone would know what happened. I hope my dad was as lucky as we were. I read through the entire message, then went back and reread the description of the creature. If it was what I thought it was amazing they were still alive. Knowing what I was tracking put me on guard and made me wonder if I was being hunted right now, if it had intentionally left things lay so it could ensnare another victim. I didn't have much hope of finding them, but I would look anyway. I started with the tracks in the camp, specifically the ones around the tents. It seemed like the boy and his uncle had gone towards the creek. The creature's tracks went that way too. It followed them to the creek where its tracks seemed to wander around as if it had lost its prey. I saw where they went into the water to throw off its scent. Smart move. I followed the meandering tracks until they came to a small bridge that forded the creek. The tracks went over the bridge, then through the creek underneath it. That didn't make sense unless they were hiding in the shadows. The creature's tracks made a sudden turn and went toward the trail, then up a hill, almost like something spooked it. If it was what I thought, I couldn't imagine anything spooking it. I followed the creature tracks up over the hill, then they doubled back and followed the creek from the top of the ridge. I noticed there was a good view of the creek. It didn't make sense to be going this way until I found myself back in the camp. It had put them right back in its sights. I was confused for a while. I couldn't find a second set of tracks where they left the second time. If the creature had slaughtered them at the campsite, there would be a lot more blood, but there wasn't. In fact, I couldn't find any proof they'd come back. Then it hit me. I went back and looked at the tracks again. There were a few here and there that were doubled. The boy and his uncle must have come back here after the bridge, then left again, the same way as before. The disturbing thing was I still hadn't seen any tracks of the father. I circled around the camp slowly, looking for anything I might have missed. Eventually, I found a set of adult tracks leaving a tent and going to the edge of the trees. They stopped facing a tree. There was a dark spot on the bark a couple of feet up. This had the earmarks of a late-night bathroom break. But the confusing thing was, the tracks never returned, like he had stopped there to relieve himself and then just disappeared. I searched all around the tree when I made a startling discovery. There were spots of blood farther up on the bark. I circled out further from the tree and found my terrible discovery, tracks of the creature with drops of blood beside it. My marrow turned to ice at the implication. I followed my new trail hoping I wouldn't find what my mind was telling me I would. I tried to report to the station on my radio, but strangely all I got in response was static. I knew there were areas out here that didn't get good reception, but I didn't think this was one of them, right near a posted campsite, just off a trail. I decided I would try again later. I adjusted my backpack and started off after my prey. As a precaution, I pulled out my sidearm and made sure it was loaded. It seemed like a silly thing to do, but when dealing with a dangerous alpha predator, it's best to make sure you're ready to shoot. My hand shook a little when I put my gun back in its holster. I knew this was dangerous. I knew it would be just as easy to go back to the station and let search and rescue take care of it. But I also knew that there was a man who was in the clutches of a deadly creature and he was losing blood. I didn't have time to waste. I followed the tracks as best I could through the brush and fallen trees. I would lose the trail sometimes only to pick it up again when I found a few more drops of blood. The tracks ran along the base of the hill heading west until it came to a stop. It was right in front of a mountain. I looked all around but the trail had disappeared. Finally, in desperation, I looked up and noticed a cave partway up the mountain. I thought about going up there but was unsure. That could be the home of this creature, or it could be the home of a dozen other animals, none of which would appreciate me storming into their living room unannounced. After another thorough look around the area, I decided it was likely where my prey had gone. Clouds had been rolling in all day, and now decided they were done playing nice. The rain began slowly enough but was soon coming down in sheets. The cave was looking better as I covered my eyes and tried to see where I was going. It was raining so hard I couldn't see the cave anymore. I just kept pressing forward in what I hoped was a straight line, over fallen trees, through brush and rapidly rising streams. I finally looked up and saw I was at the base of the mountain. My direction was off by a little bit, and I had ended up a few dozen yards to the right of it, but it was no matter. I started climbing the mountain, being extra careful of my footing, especially in this torrential downpour. After a few slips, including one that had me nearly tumbling off the mountain, I made it to the mouth of the cave. I slipped inside and enjoyed a moment without water dumping on me. I looked down and the water dripping off of me made a little puddle like I had brought my own rain cloud into the cave with me. I shook off as much water as I could, as quietly as possible. The rain pouring down outside made loud splashes inside the cave. It would have been difficult to hear anything else, but I still wanted to be sure. I unbuckled and sat the backpack down just inside the mouth of the cave. The rain had made it gain extra weight and I didn't know if I would have to move fast. I opened my pack and got out my bottle of water and drank. It had been a while since I had drank anything, and I chugged half of it down. I closed it and saved the other half for if I got out of here alive. With that happy thought rattling around in my brain, I stowed the water bottle back in my pack and pulled out a small flashlight. I turned it on while pointing it at the floor. The bright beam illuminated the cave. It was large as caves go. I could stand up in it and not reach the ceiling. There were many boulders and stones. It wasn't a smooth floor. The walls were rough. There weren't any cave drawings in here. I walked slowly. Each step felt like I was closer to my doom. I pulled out my gun and held it tightly, the sense of foreboding thick in the air. Two thoughts impressed themselves on me. Firing a gun in here would probably deafen me, and the stench was horrific. It smelled like an open sewer in the middle of August. As I crept deeper into the cave, the sounds of the rain diminished, replaced by an eerie silence. I could hear the step of my feet, my breathing, and my heart pounding. I was seriously considering turning around and leaving when I saw something ahead of me move. It was big, at least as big as me. I dove against the wall for some cover, forgetting that I was holding a bright light in my hand so it didn't matter if I tried to hide as long as the light was on. I pointed it at the floor but didn't turn it off. I heard a shuffling sound getting closer. I was tempted to turn off the light, but giving the edge to this creature was not a good idea. It already had the home field advantage. I heard it sniffing, but I couldn't see it yet. I decided to find out more by bringing my light up and shining it deeper into the cave. I got the shock of my life when my light landed on the creature and it was only a few steps away. It was big, at least 6 feet tall, and looked like a dog with a long snout, only its body seemed elongated. It stood on its hind legs and had hands attached to muscular arms. Overall, it looked like a nightmare. It recoiled from the light and let out a growl. It was all I could do to keep from soiling myself. Without thinking, I pointed my gun and fired. The sound was deafening. My ears instantly started ringing. The creature creature roared at me, then turned and ran deeper into the cave. It had roared a mere few feet from me, yet I barely heard it. I stumbled and had to take a minute to steady myself. Then I started following it deeper into the cave. To this day, I really don't know why, other than needing to know if the hiker was alive. I looked at the ground to see if there was any blood, but there wasn't. I must have just startled it with the shot. That wasn't great news. I'd hoped I would have hit it and it was wounded. Just scared meant it would be ready to fight when I saw it again. After all, I'm sure to the creature I was the invader and it was defending its home. I continued farther into the cave, shining my light and watching for any sudden movement. I had no idea where it was or if it was setting a trap for me. I felt a whiff of air and jumped back a split second before the claws sliced the air where my face would have been. I rolled and came up shooting, holding my light beside the gun to illuminate my target. I fired over and over, pointing and shooting without having the time to aim. I watched as it ducked every shot and ran with inhuman speed. Just before it disappeared from sight, I saw it skip a step as I fired my last shot. My hope soared that I had hit it at least once. I ejected the magazine and put a fresh one in, reminding myself that I only had one more and chastising myself for not being more careful with my limited ammo. I justified it by telling myself there's no use dying with a full magazine. I followed once again, nearly jumping for joy when I came to the spot where it had disappeared and saw a spot of fresh blood on the ground. I was hoping for more, but as I went, the drops were every few feet. Even though it didn't seem like much, at the speed it was running I was sure it had sprung a major leak. I followed the trail deeper into the cave. There was a chill in the air that made me shudder. My mind told me it felt like a tomb. My tomb. I shook off those thoughts and continued until the blood stopped. I shined my light on the small puddle in the ground beyond where there was no blood. My mind screamed at me that it was a trap. I shined my light all around, even on the ceiling, but I couldn't see it. I started backing out the same way I'd come in, my eyes darting all around in search of my prey. It hit me like a bulldozer going 60 miles an hour. It had come out of nowhere and rammed me in the back. I sprawled out on the floor, rolling to a stop. My flashlight lay a few feet away, and I had no idea where the gun was. The wind was knocked out of me. I tried to breathe but couldn't. I just lay there gasping for air. It slowly circled around me, growling and bristling. I knew it was going for the kill. I screamed at my brain to move, but my body refused to cooperate. I tried to focus on my breathing and regain mobility as it circled closer. I could see its breath chugging out of its body like a steam engine. I knew it was time. My arm was the first to recover. I slowly moved it toward the flashlight. It stopped circling just as I got a grip on the light. I saw the creature hunching to lunge at me. I clicked the light to strobe and aimed it at the creature's face. It screamed and clawed at the air as if it could fight off the light. I rose to my knees, keeping the light on it. When it turned away, I shined it around, desperately searching for my gun. I found it a few yards away and tried to run for it, but my body hadn't fully recovered and I fell flat on my face. My life in the balance, I didn't bother with the pain of my freshly broken nose. I crawled toward the gun with every ounce of energy in me. It seemed like an eternity until I put my hand on the grip and brought it to bear on the creature. It had recovered and was running at me full speed. I shined the strobe at it again and it veered away from the light. I stood and aimed at it, squeezing the trigger. I saw the satisfying impact of the bullet in its side and squeezed the trigger again, making another hole on the far side of its chest. I squeezed over and over, hitting it each time and watching it reel from the impact, but it stayed on its feet. It growled and charged as my slide locked back, showing an empty chamber. I shined the strobe in its eyes once more, but this time it just ran off to the other side of the room. I used the distraction to eject my magazine and load in the last full one. I released the slide and started firing immediately, hitting it in the hind quarter and leg, but not stopping it. I stopped shooting and forced myself to concentrate. I aimed carefully as it ran toward me, and at the right moment, I squeezed the trigger. It went down hard, squealing like a stuck pig. It thrashed and clawed at its face, tumbling over itself. Blood flew everywhere from its many gunshot wounds, but it still continued flailing about and squealing in pain. After a few minutes of this, it finally settled down and was still enough for me to see my handiwork. I had shot it in the eye. There was nothing left there but a bloody hole. I didn't dare approach it. I stood at a respectful distance and watched, my gun ready if it tried to make a move. Its squeals became moans, finally turning into a heavy sigh, and then it was still. I shined the light on it, feeling cautiously optimistic that this thing was no longer a threat. And then I remembered what I was doing here in the first place. I tried to get my bearings and proceeded further into the cave. My main thought was not only finding the hiker alive, but also hoping and praying there wasn't another one of those creatures here. I didn't have another fight like that in me. The path curved downwards until it came to a large open area. I shined the light around, looking for anything. Off in the far corner, there was a flash of red as I panned through. I approached it cautiously and found it was a jacket. Inside was a piece of meat that used to be a human being. His throat had been ripped out and his legs were gone. All that was left of them were some bones. The thing must have been working its way up, saving the arms and torso for later. The man's face was a frozen scream. I can't even imagine the horror of being dragged away from your loved ones, only to be murdered and eaten in some cold, dark cave. I wasn't even sure if he was dead when the thing ripped his legs off. I had to stop focusing on such things and decide what to do. If I left the remains here, there was no doubt some other animal would come by and finish off what the creature had started. I needed to try to get him to his family for closure and a proper burial. I bent down, trying to figure out how to carry him. A fireman's carry was out. There were no legs for counterbalance. In the end, I picked him up by his arms and flung them over my shoulder, holding onto them and turning his body into some macabre backpack. I started back out of the cave, hoping I'd be able to carry him all the way back to the campsite, and finally back to my truck. As I trudged back through the cave, I came to the section where our fight had taken place. Shell casings and blood were strewn about the ground. I wondered to myself how I had avoided getting hit by a stray ricochet when I looked over to where the creature lay. Only it wasn't there. I shined my light all around, frantically whipping around, but it was gone. I found the spot where it had laid still, and I thought it had died. There was a large pool of blood there, but no body. I pulled my gun out of my holster, ejected the magazine, and checked to see how many rounds I had left. There were only 2. I hoped wherever that thing was, that it was no longer in the mood for hunting or revenge. In the end, I decided there was nothing I could do. If the thing attacked me, I was defenseless, carrying literal dead weight on my back. I holstered the gun and hitched up my human backpack, then shined the light toward the mouth of the cave and kept walking. My hearing was just starting to return to normal, although I was sure I would have some permanent hearing loss. I could hear the shuffling of my feet as I staggered toward the cave opening. When I got there, I found a world transformed. Daylight was just starting to peek its way around the dark. However, the rain had created a massive fog bank. I couldn't see anything down in the valley I came from. It was a sea of fog. Only the peaks of the mountains escaped its suffocating blanket. I looked over and saw my backpack patiently waiting for my return. I laid my burden down and got the water bottle out, glad that I had saved the last drink for now. As I sat on the edge of the cave, I looked down and wondered how I was going to get the body down there without falling to my own death. For an instant, it was tempting to throw it down and find it at the bottom once I climbed down, but I thought this fellow had been through enough and didn't need the indignity of becoming a human frisbee. I dug through my backpack and found some bungee cords. I bungeed him to my back and carefully started my descent, leaving my faithful backpack to watch me. I wished I could take it with me, but there was no way I could carry both. As I climbed down, there were a few times I lost footing and nearly took the short and deadly route down. Fortunately, I made it to the bottom in one piece. Instead of celebrating though, I discovered a new problem. The fog was so thick, I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I had no idea how I was going to find my way out of there. I decided to go straight away from the mountain and hope the fog cleared as I went. The rain had turned the forest into a marshland. The ground was soft and the streams had overgrown their banks. I found myself wading through knee-deep water on more than one occasion. As I trudged along, hoping I had enough energy to get back without collapsing from exhaustion, 2 thoughts chased each other around my mind. Where were the other hikers, and where was the creature? I hadn't seen any other remains in the cave. If it had killed them, it hadn't had time to take them back to the cave yet. Perhaps my pursuit had forced it to retreat to its cave before it could properly retrieve its other bounty. I had kept my ears open for any sounds of it following me. The most concerning thing was the lack of forest noises. The animals and birds were strangely silent. Usually, that meant there was a predator nearby. In this ungodly fog, perhaps they were just sleeping waiting for it to clear. That sounded good. It gave me the false illusion that I wasn't in mortal danger from a wounded alpha predator bent on revenge. But I couldn't focus on that, or worry would drain my resolve to get us both out of there. I took a break from trudging and tried to get my bearings. I checked my watch and I had been walking for over an hour. It was late morning and the sun should have been high in the sky, but the oppressive fog continued to smother it. I looked around, but there was nothing to see except the dingy gray curtain of hopelessness. I was about to collapse and give up when I heard it, the faint sound of hope. I could hear the creek running. As hope rose, it was suddenly dashed. I heard the sound of a footstep behind me. I whipped around so fast that my macabre backpack nearly made me lose my balance. I couldn't see anything through the fog. But that didn't mean it wasn't there. With a renewed surge of determination, along with a strong desire to elude whatever was pursuing me, I set out toward the sound of the creek. It was still slow going, but I found fearing for my life was a great motivator. I had no doubt whatsoever that the footsteps behind me were those of the creature bent on revenge. After what seemed like an eternity, I gazed at the most awesome sight I'd seen all day, Wolf Creek in all its 6-foot wide, overflowing banks glory. I followed it until I came across Lakeshore Trail, and the journey became much easier. The fog was even beginning to lift, which was a blessing but also a curse. I could finally see far enough behind me to confirm that the creature was indeed following me. I'd wondered the entire time why it hadn't overtaken me, but now that I caught sight of it, I understood. It was grotesque. It looked like it came straight from hell. Its one eye socket was leaking gore, and the many bullet wounds covered it in blood. There were places where I could see internal organs trying to escape the body, and its right leg had a bullet wound. It limped severely. As I watched it, I wondered how it had made it this far, but then I looked into its remaining eye and saw intense rage burning. I knew I would die a horribly grotesque death if I slowed enough for it to catch up. We continued this slow pursuit of death until I reached the banks where Wolf Creek opened up into the lake. My energy was nearly gone. At one point I considered dropping my human backpack in hopes that it would feed on it instead of me, but then I would have failed. I came here to find this hiker and bring him back. The thought lit a fire deep within me. I came to the edge of the lake, with the creature a mere few yards behind me. I glanced around, hoping to see a boat I could flag down, but no such luck. With no other choice, I waded into the water. It was cold, but instead of refreshing me, it chilled me and sapped my little remaining strength. The creature entered the water behind me and seemed to be gaining. It got deeper to the point where I was no longer able to walk and had to start swimming. The far side of the lake looked like it was miles away, even though I knew it was much less than that. I swam for all I was worth, knowing at any moment I would be pulled under by the creature. My passenger strapped to my back wasn't helping either. The literal definition of dead weight every minute. I had to fight off the urge to dump him. When I reached the other side, I was exhausted. I lay there on the shore, waiting for the creature to disembowel me, but unable to move to defend myself in any way. With great effort, I turned to look back and see when my doom would come. To my great surprise, I saw it staring at me from the far beach. I guess it couldn't swim. I chuckled to myself as I lay there gathering strength for the continued journey back to the truck. Eventually, I got there. As I opened the door, for a fleeting moment I considered putting the hiker in the passenger's seat. But then I looked at the wet, gore-soaked torso and reconsidered, gently laying him in the truck bed. The drive back was long and I continually had to shake myself to stay awake. But eventually, I made it to the cabin. I stumbled up to the door and knocked once. "Oh my God," the woman said when she saw me. "Are you alright?" I hung my head. "No, but I will be after around 3 days of sleep. Unfortunately, I have bad news for you. I found your husband, but not your son or brother-in-law." A man and a boy came out of the cabin and stared at me. I instantly knew who they were and grabbed them both in a huge hug. "I'm so glad you made it out," I said, fighting back tears. Thanks," the man said, pulling out of my hug. "Who are you again?" "He's the ranger that came to look for all 3 of you," she said. "I don't understand. Your tracks were confusing," I said. I followed them down to the bridge, but then they went back up to the campsite. "We got some rest," the boy said. "Then Uncle Roger came and said we were going. We left everything and slipped away to the boat, rowed across the river and left." I smiled. "I'm very glad you did." He looked at me with expectant eyes. "You said you found my dad." My face fell. "I did, but it was too late." "So, I nodded somberly. "Where is he?" "He's in my truck, but you don't want to see that." Before I could say another word, he ran to the truck and looked in the passenger's seat. A look of confusion fell over his eyes as he saw no one there, and then he slowly looked toward the bed of the truck. He stepped back and looked over the side into the bed. He instantly dissolved into tears and slid down the side of the truck sobbing. "I'm so sorry," I said to the woman and man. She grabbed me and gave me a hug. "Don't be," she said. "Without you, we wouldn't have known for weeks, months, maybe even years what had happened. We would go on looking with false hope. You've given us a chance for closure and to properly grieve." She released me and I wiped my eyes. I looked at the man and walked down to the truck. He followed and we gently removed the body and laid him on the couch, then covered him with a blanket. The boy followed us back to the cabin, but wouldn't look at me or anyone else. He sat in a chair and stared at the blanket covering his father's body. I knew I had done all I could, so I excused myself and started toward the door. I paused and said to the boy, "I promise I'll make sure that thing never hurts anyone again." He looked up at me, eyes full of tears, and said, "How will that help my dad?" His mother opened her mouth, but I held a hand up to silence her. I knew the boy was just hurting. I left without another word. On the drive back, I called the station and told them everything that had happened. Told them I was going home and calling off for the following day. After getting home and stumbling into a shower and collapsing in bed, there was only one thought on my mind. I would return to Wolf Creek very soon with more and bigger guns. I would end that monster if it was the last thing I did. But that is another story. I knew it was a mistake to let Joel lead us. I just didn't know how horrible a mistake it was and how steep the cost would be. "We're lost, aren't we?" I said to Joel, who was turning the map upside down and then back again. "No, of course not," he said, flipping the map once more. "I know exactly where we are." The fact that he was dating my best friend was the only thing that kept me from ripping that map out of his hands. I walked away in disgust before I said or did something I would regret. I went and found Marie sitting by the fire, talking to Trey. "Will you please tell your boyfriend that we're lost?" I said. "We're not lost, we just don't know exactly where we are," Marie said with a playful smile. "It's not funny," I said through gritted teeth. "Sure it is," Trey said. "Sit down here by the fire and chill out. The six of us haven't taken a trip together in how long? Enjoy it." "But we're lost," I said. "So what?" Trey said. "We just got camp set up. This is the first day of our trip. We have 3 more to go." "Look, we will find out where we are tomorrow," Marie said. "I promise." I looked at her with eyes full of doubt. "Yeah, you should enjoy yourself," Trey said. "Look around at all this beautiful nature. Kinda makes you feel insignificant, doesn't it?" I looked around at the trees that surrounded us on all sides. The only good thing about where we had camped was it was on the top of a small hill, so there was plenty to see, even if it was mostly treetops. "Nature can be dangerous," I said, sitting down and grabbing a stick. Marie shook her head. "That's my best friend, Little Miss Sunshine." I impaled a marshmallow with the end of my stick and dangled it over the flames, watching intently as they scorched the flesh, turning it dark brown. "I'm gonna need a graham cracker and a candy bar, stat," I said as Marie grinned at me. "That's more like it," Trey said, handing me the items. I carefully pulled the marshmallow off the stick, in between the crackers and chocolate, setting the stick aside as I relished in devouring my treat. Jeannie appeared in the firelight as we burst into laughter. "Did I miss something?" she said. "You had to be there," Trey said. "I was here," Jeannie said. "I was right over there, setting up my tent while the rest of you lay around and wait for nightfall, then asked me to help you." She said in a huff. I stuck a marshmallow on a stick and handed it to her. She took it and hovered it over the fire. "Be careful," I said. "Don't let that stick go back up your ass." Marie and Trey lost it and howled with laughter. Jeannie turned red and threw the stick in the fire, marshmallow and all, then stormed off. We watched her go. I said, "I guess she has another stick." They roared with laughter again. "What's so funny?" Soren said, sitting down on the log and eyeing the stick in the fire. Trey looked at us and said, "You had to be there." Marie, Trey, and I exploded with laughter while Soren just stared at us, mystified. "Oh, okay," he said, then grabbed another stick and started roasting a marshmallow of his own. "Hey, keep it down," Joel said, coming over and sitting down. "Why, are we gonna wake the wildlife?" Marie said, punching his arm. "We don't want to attract too much attention to ourselves," he said. "Will the owls call the cops on us for disturbing the peace?" Trey said, causing a round of snickers. "I just don't want to draw the attention of anything bigger," Joel said. I couldn't let it go. I had to open my mouth. "Like what, Joel?" I said, practically daring him to answer me. "I don't know, like bigger," he said, keeping his eyes focused on the fire instead of mine. "Like what? A deer? A bear?" I said. He shrugged. "Or a skinwalker." Everyone around the fire showed some form of exasperation. Soren shook his head. Trey rolled his eyes. Marie put her face in her palm, and I just stared at him. "Please tell me you don't actually believe in that crap," I said. Still looking down, he shrugged his shoulders. "Kinda, I guess," he said. I was just about to tell him just how asinine he was when from the fading light of the forest came the piercing sound of a woman's shriek. We each looked at each other as if to confirm that we had all heard it. "Was that Jeannie?" I said. Instantly we were all on our feet. We dashed over to Jeannie's tent, but she wasn't there. Trey produced a flashlight and shined it around at the trees. "Where did it come from?" he said. I got my flashlight from my own pack and shined it around the same area as Trey. "It seemed like it was in this direction," I said. "No, it was over here," Joel said, pointing his light in the opposite direction. I bit my tongue to keep the comment about his lack of direction to myself. "Why don't you two go that way and Trey and I go this way?" I said, pointing at Joel and Marie. "What should I do?" Soren said. "Stay at the campsite in case she comes back and needs help," I said. "What if I need help?" he said, looking around at the trees as though they had all become monsters. I shrugged. "Scream," I said, then disappeared into the forest with Trey. There was still a sliver of light in the sky, but dusk was losing its fight against the oncoming darkness. We wove our way slowly through the trees. It seemed like it became darker the further we went, as if the trees themselves were sucking the light out of the air. Our flashlights fought a valiant battle against the dark, but they were merely pinpricks of light against the oppressive darkness. "Jeannie," I called out, hearing only my own voice echo back. I suddenly became aware of how much noise we were making, tromping through the woods, looking for our friend. Trey kept moving, silent and steady. He didn't seem to be making as much noise as me, despite being nearly twice my size. "Jeannie," I called again, getting no response. "Hold on," Trey said, holding out his arm, forcing me to stop. "Do you hear that?" I listened, and at first, I didn't hear anything, not even the animals that usually make noise at night. It was a little weird, and I didn't like it. "I don't hear anything," I said. "Listen," he said, holding up a finger to his mouth. I fought down the anger of telling him again that I didn't hear anything when suddenly I did. It was faint, but I could hear a river. He nodded. "Do you think she would have gone down there?" I said. "I don't know, but I think we owe it to her to check it out," he said, starting off toward the sound of running water. We had been heading downhill the entire time, but before it was a gentle slope, where now it had gotten steeper. We had to hold on to trees to keep from sliding all the way down to the river, bouncing off trees as we went. That was one activity I didn't want to check off for this camping trip. But searching for a missing friend wasn't on my list either. We made it down to the river and found it was fast running. We made sure to keep away from the water so we wouldn't get swept away. "If she fell in here, she'd be halfway to the ocean by now," I said. But Trey didn't seem to hear me. He was frozen in place, eyes wide, staring across the river. "What's wrong?" I said, following his eyes when I caught sight of exactly what was wrong. On the other side of the river was something. It was hard to see, but it was some kind of animal. It was covered with light gray fur that seemed almost silver. It was big, at least as big as a bear, but leaner. It stood on its hind legs and had hands at the end of its arms. The claws and fangs were the real eye magnet. They looked like they were ready to tear us apart. It glared at us with the intensity of a hungry predator. "You're seeing this, right?" Trey whispered. "You mean that thing that looks like it wants to make us a late-night snack?" "Yeah, that's it." "Do you think Jeannie saw it too?" I hadn't thought about that. I would be more worried about it seeing her. "I don't know, but I think we should go back to the camp." "Yeah," he said, backing slowly away from the river and starting up the hill, trying to keep his eye on the creature the whole time. I tried the same thing, but after I slipped and fell, nearly sliding back down to the water, I decided I should pay attention to climbing. It was a lot harder than I thought, climbing back up that hill. By the time we made it to the easier part, I was soaked in sweat and breathing hard. I looked over at Trey and found him breathing normal. "You make me sick," I said through gasps of breath. He smiled. They make these things called gyms, you know. I gave him the finger as I doubled over trying to catch my breath. He chuckled. Maybe you can use your muscles to fight off that thing we saw if it follows us up the hill. He glanced back down the hill toward the river. Do you think it did? I have no idea, I said. Do you think we should tell the others? And fuel Joel's imagination. I said, don't you think he would go into full-on panic mode? You're probably right. He would want to pack up and leave, which might not be a bad idea, but not without Jeannie. Agreed. We hiked the rest of the way up the hill in silence. At one point we seemed to lose our way, but turning off our flashlights revealed the glow of the fire off in the distance, to the right. We followed it and came across the camp, but it was empty. We looked in the tents for Soren, but he was nowhere around. Just as we finished searching, Joel burst through the trees and into the firelight, breathing hard. What happened to you? Trey said. Where's Marie? I said. We got separated and I tried to find her, but got turned around and ended up back here, he said. I stepped over and grabbed his shirt, pulling him to me, even though he was a good 6 inches taller than me. You lost her, I said, barely keeping my cool. Well, not lost, just misplaced, he said. I'll misplace you, I said, drawing back my fist like I was going to punch him. He recoiled and held his arm up to block the blow. Just as I was about to swing, Marie stepped into the firelight. What's going on? She said, eyes wide at me, about to beat the crap out of her boyfriend. I let him go and turned to her. He said he lost you, I said. I actually said misplaced, he said, then cringed back, withering under my glare. And yet here I am, not lost, she said. Did you find Jeannie? I shook my head. We didn't either, she said. What do we do? I think it's obvious we're not going to find her in the dark, I said. We should look in the morning. What about Soren? Trey said. What about Soren? Marie said. He's missing, Trey said. We came back and he was gone, I said. We should go look for him, Joel said. I turned on him and he took a half step back. I just said we shouldn't search in the dark. Yeah, but that was for Jeannie. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Is it any less dark now? I said. No, Joel said, looking around. Then we shouldn't look for Soren either. He opened his mouth as if to protest, then thought better and closed it. I suggest one of us stays up for a couple hours while the others get some sleep, I said. Why? Joel said. Because, I floundered, not wanting to tell them about the creature because Joel would go into a full-on panic. We need to keep the fire going so they can find their way back. Joel looked at me like a dog that had heard a strange sound. I agree, Marie said. I'll stay up for a while and tend the fire. Joel looked at her with a pleading look. And then I'll come to bed, she said. I'll relieve you in a couple hours, Trey said. Then come wake me after that, I said. We all looked at Joel, but he had turned and stormed off to his tent in a huff. I grinned at Marie. Was someone looking forward to getting a little something this evening? Her cheeks flushed. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, throwing her nose in the air. Now be gone from my sight and sleep the sleep of the dead. I didn't dare react beyond a smile. I didn't want her to panic either. I shot a fake smile at her and turned to my tent, hoping that thing had stayed on its side of the river. I woke to a dark tent. Panic flooded me as I saw a large silhouette reaching for me. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it at the creature, not knowing what I would do next. Ouch, it said. What the hell did you do that for? I turned the light on to find Trey holding his wrist. Sorry, you scared me, I said, knowing that was a weak excuse. It's your turn to watch, he said, turning and leaving my tent. I sighed. I would have to apologize again when he woke up. I hadn't changed out of my clothes, but decided I should take a sweatshirt with me to fend off the cool forest air. I stepped out and knew I'd made the right decision. There was a chill on the breeze that made me hug myself as I stepped over and added another log to the fire. I watched the flames dance, allowing myself to be mesmerized and hoping I could stay awake until sunrise. As I sat in silence, I heard muffled conversation coming from Joel and Marie's tent. A few minutes later, it was replaced by soft moans. I smiled. Joel was getting what he wanted. As the intensity of the sounds increased, I found myself the slightest bit jealous. Not that I had any feelings for Joel, but I hadn't been in a relationship for a while, and that might be a nice way to relax on a camping trip. As I pondered these things, I heard rustling in the trees. My senses went on full red alert as I grabbed my flashlight and shined it where I thought the sound came from. The wind had died down to nearly nothing, but there were branches moving where I heard the sound. My light was having a hard time staying on one area. I was shaking so badly. What would I do? How would I protect my friends from this huge creature? I didn't know if anyone had brought a gun or not, but all I had was a small pocket knife. Unfortunately, it was in my tent, and I was currently frozen in fear, rooted to the spot. I watched helplessly as the thing came closer. I could see the branches in the closest trees moving now. It was almost here. I held my breath, listening for any growling, but only hearing the moans coming from the tent behind me. I finally forced myself to stand. If I was going to warn anyone or run away from this thing, I would have to be on my feet. The light was shaking badly as the creature stepped out into the open, and I sucked in a breath of air in shock. "Jenny," she stumbled as I ran to her and caught her before she fell. "Are you alright?" I said as a reflex before I had a chance to look her over. I realized what a stupid question I'd asked. Her clothes were ripped in several places and there were patches of red soaked into them. "What happened to you?" I said. She crumbled into my arms and I helped her back to her tent. She seemed exhausted, allowing me to support her weight as much as possible. She mumbled through ragged breaths, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. When I got her to her tent and laid her down on her sleeping bag, she sighed deeply. Her eyes were closed before I left. As I stepped out, I heard her mutter a single word: "Soren." A chill ran down my spine. Did she mean Soren had done this? Or was Soren in trouble too? I stepped back out into the cool air with a mixture of relief, puzzlement, and fear. Jeannie had returned, but Soren was still gone. What had Jeannie gone through? Was she attacked by the creature we saw? How did she get away from it? Did she see Soren? She wouldn't have known he was gone unless she'd seen him. What was his deal anyway to just up and vanish like that? I would have a lot of questions for Jeannie when she woke. I did a quick look around before sitting back down on the log. The nightly noises had resumed, but the tent behind me was silent. They must have finished their little rendezvous. I had a funny but terrifying thought. Who usually gets killed first in horror movies? The ones who have sex. I hoped for all our sakes that this trip didn't end up like a horror movie. The rest of my watch went smoothly, unless you count me sitting bolt upright and nearly peeing myself every time I heard a rustle or a noise in the woods. When Marie came out of her tent in the morning looking all refreshed and glowing, I wanted to slap her. "How was your sleep?" I asked her, not really wanting to know the answer. "Was it peaceful?" She sighed with contentment, completely missing by verbal jab. "Absolutely." I snorted with disgust as I yawned and stretched. "Okay, I'm going back to bed," I said. "Oh, and Jeannie came back in the night." "What?" she said. "What happened to her? Is she alright? Why did she roam off?" "I don't know." "You don't know?" She collapsed in my arms and I had to half carry her to her tent, I said, with a little more edge than I wanted. It wasn't time for 20 questions. She took a half step back. "Just wake me when she feels like talking," I said. "Until then, I'm going to sleep." I stepped past her, opened my tent, and collapsed onto my sleeping bag. I'd barely closed my eyes until someone was shaking me awake. "Leave me alone, I just laid down," I said, swatting them away like a fly. "That was 4 hours ago," Trey said. "Jeannie's awake and wants to talk to us." I reluctantly rolled over and looked at him. "It's seriously been 4 hours. He nodded. "Fine," I said, struggling to my feet and stretching. We walked out to find the sun high in the sky and Jeannie sitting on the log, drinking some coffee. Joel and Marie were seated beside her. I sat on the other side next to the smoldering fire. Trey stood as she lowered her cup to speak. "I was angry with the three of you," she said, looking at me, Trey, and Marie, "so I decided to go for a walk in the woods to cool off. I didn't really care which direction I went. I just walked. Once I had cooled down and turned to come back, I must have gotten off track and couldn't find the camp. I wandered around for hours in the dark, desperately trying to find my way. I was thrilled when I bumped into Soren, but there was something wrong with him. He grinned at me in a way I'd never seen him do. And then, she started sobbing. Marie reached over and laid her hand on her shoulder. "Did he fall or get hurt?" "No," Jeannie said. "He transformed." "I'm sorry," I said. "Transformed into what?" It was hard to see very well because it was dark, but he grew bigger, taller, and hairy. His arms and legs became longer and he grew claws. I glanced at Trey, who was standing as still as a stone, taking everything in. I clamped my mouth shut as Jeannie continued her story. "I didn't know what else to do but run," she said. "But no matter where I ran, he caught up with me. Every time he caught me, he would slash at me." She pulled her shirt up enough to show slash marks on her belly, then her back and her arms. I knew it was only a matter of time time before he got me, so I tried to hide. I found an old tree that had fallen and dug into the dirt around its roots. I made a big enough hole to hide in and covered myself with leaves. He stalked back and forth in front of me a few times as I focused on being as still as possible. After a while, I heard my name being called, but I didn't dare respond. I looked at Trey, who still hadn't moved. I fell asleep somehow, probably the adrenaline crash. When I woke, it was nearly light. I took my chance to find my way back to camp. Thank God I did before he got back. Wow, Joel said. Who would have thought Soren was a monster? Trey said, his face a mask of impassiveness. What do we do? Marie said. All eyes fell on her. I mean, obviously he'll be back at some point, Marie said. Maybe he'll change back and try to pretend nothing happened. That's what I was thinking, Jeannie said. Try to catch us off guard. But why pretend if he's this powerful monster? I said. Animal instinct, Joel said, with a far-off look. Even the strongest predator doesn't dive right into the middle of the herd. They wait to pick off the weak and the stragglers. I stared at him for a long moment. It was the smartest thing I'd ever heard him say. Did anyone bring a gun? Trey said. We all looked from one to the other. Slowly, Marie raised her hand. We all stared at her in shock. What? We're in the woods, she said. You never know what you might run across, including a homicidal friend turned monster, Jeannie said, her eyes focused in the distance as if her thoughts were miles away. May we borrow your gun, Marie? Trey said. Why? I think from this moment on, we need to have someone keeping watch at all times, Trey said, and that someone should be armed. Marie hesitated, then went to her tent and returned a minute later holding a snub-nosed .38. She handed it to Trey, who opened the cylinder to make sure it was loaded, then closed it. Who wants to take the first watch while everyone else packs up? Trey said. Packs up. Joel said. Do you want to wait until this thing hunts us down one by one and kills us all? Trey said. Joel looked around from eye to eye. No, of course not, he said. Then we need to leave. There's just one problem, I said, glaring at Joel. We don't know where we are. Trey shot a look at Joel, who immediately stared at the ground. We'll deal with that when we have to, Trey said. In the meantime, let's get packed up. Everyone hurried about the camp, packing and gathering their belongings. Trey stood silent the entire time watching. When I was done, he gave me the gun while he packed up. Before long, we were all ready to go. The only holdout was Soren's tent that stood undisturbed. Do you think we should take his stuff home? Joel said. Why? Jeannie said. He doesn't need it anymore. Joel stared at her for a long moment, then shouldered his pack and helped Marie put hers on. We grabbed a quick lunch before we doused the remains of the fire and started on our trek to find our way home. I just hoped we survived that long. I know that wasn't a very cheery thought, but something about this felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. I guess having a friend you've known for years turn out to be a supernatural, homicidal creature will do that. It was early afternoon when we finally set out. We unfortunately let Joel lead, hoping he could somehow get us unlost by remembering the way he had brought us here. 3 hours later, the clueless look in his eye made us switch and give the reins to Trey. Okay, he said, looking over the map. It looks like we're here, so we have at least a day's walk to get back to the trailhead. If I'm reading this map right. Joel snorted, but we all ignored it. Should we take a bathroom break before we start again? I said. Good idea, Trey said, looking at each of us. Where's Jeannie? I whipped around and looked, but she wasn't there. I know she was with us just 20 minutes ago. I ran back to the top of a hill we had just crested and looked all around. The hill gave me a good view of the way we'd just come, but I couldn't see her. Vainly I'd hoped she had just fallen behind and paused to take a breather, or she needed a bathroom break before the rest of us, but she was gone. The others came up behind me and looked, but we all seemed to come to the same conclusion. Again, I said. He's picking off the weakest of the herd, Joel said. Jeannie's not an animal, I growled. I know she's not, he backpedaled. I'm just saying that's the way predators work. What now? Marie said. If we stay here, we're exposed. He could see us for miles and we'd have a hard time knowing he was coming. Trey sighed deeply. I don't want to just leave without making sure she didn't just fall or something, he said. Joel and I will go back the trail a little ways and see if we can find her. You two stay here, but keep a low profile. He handed Marie her gun. Just in case, he said. Joel looked like he wanted to do literally anything other than go search for Jeannie, but he reluctantly removed his pack, then kissed Marie and followed after Trey. Marie and I tried to settle our nerves with a little small talk, but the sounds of the forest had us constantly whipping around looking for noises and hoping none of them were Soren coming to kill us. As we waited, we heard rustling in the woods. Whatever it was big. Marie held out her gun at the ready, but I could see the barrel shaking. I can't say I blame her, my nerves were fried too. We stayed as still as possible, hoping he didn't notice us and would just move on. No such luck. Finally, the creature showed itself. We both sighed with relief to find it was a bear. Then realization hit us. It was a bear. Bears can kill people just as efficiently as Soren can. We focused on staying still as it lumbered up to us and sniffed the air just a few feet away from us. It took another step closer, still sniffing. Marie pulled the gun up and aimed it at the bear. "Don't," I shouted. "It'll just make him mad." She pointed the gun towards the sky and squeezed the trigger. The shot was deafening. My ears began ringing immediately. The bear didn't like it either. Fortunately, instead of swiping the gun out of Marie's hand, he turned and ran like he'd been shot in the backside. Marie turned to me with a look of triumph. "Good job," I said sarcastically. "What?" she said, holding her hand behind her ear. I said, "Never mind." Trey came running up the trail. "Are you okay?" he said, looking at me more than Marie. "Yeah, Annie Oakley here just scared off a bear by firing a gun like an inch from my ear," I said. "So I won't be hearing much for the rest of my life." "What?" Marie said. "Did you find her?" I said to Trey. "No, we didn't see any sign of her," Trey said. "Where's Joel?" Marie said. Just then Joel appeared on the trail, walking slowly, obviously winded. He saw us looking at him and waved as he paused and bent over to catch his breath. "He's never heard of a gym either," Trey said, nudging my shoulder. I was starting to think the next place we camped I might invite Trey into my tent for a little relaxation like Marie and Joel had last night. Suddenly the creature appeared behind Joel. It grabbed him and slashed its claws across his throat. Blood sprayed as the world went to slow motion. I could hear Marie screaming. I saw Trey grab her to keep her from running to save Joel. I heard her fire off shot after shot. One of the shots hit the creature, 2 of them hit Joel. I'll never forget the look of hurt and betrayal in his eyes as he saw Marie holding the gun just before his head slumped over. Marie stopped shooting. Her eyes grew wide as she realized what she'd done. Her arms went limp at her sides and the gun fell to the ground. The rest of her wasn't far behind as she collapsed to the forest floor, sobbing. Trey and I stared at each other in shock. It all happened so quickly it seemed unreal. When we looked back where the creature and Joel had been, they were gone. The only thing left behind was a distraught Marie, and Joel's blood sprayed all over the plants. I bent down to Marie, but there were no words of consolation that I could think of. There was no comfort to give. This thing was hunting us one at a time, and I had no doubt that we were next. I couldn't believe that just 2 days ago we all came stomping through the same patch of forest, laughing and carrying on, having a great time. And now, half our group was dead, and we were all that was left. I knew Soren wasn't dead. I'd just seen him rip Joel's throat out, but he was dead to me. If I ever got the chance to end him, I would do it without hesitation. I started shaking and couldn't stop. Trey reached over and pulled me into a hug. He held me until the shaking stopped, then we both looked at Marie. She was laying on the ground, only half visible through the foliage, shaking. "Marie," I said, not knowing what I would say next. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were locked on the spot where we'd last seen Joel. I'm sure all she could see was his look of betrayal. As she lay there, I saw her blink for the first time since Joel had stepped out of the woods. Her eyes focused on something in front of her. I followed her gaze and saw the gun. Before I could react, she grabbed it, pressed it to her head and pulled the trigger. "No," I screamed as the gun clicked on a spent round. She squeezed the trigger over and over, but all it did was click like a toy. She threw it down in disgust, then got up and started walking toward where we'd seen Joel and Soren last. "Where are you going?" Trey said, starting after her. "I'm going to find that thing and kill it," she said without breaking stride. "With what?" "My bare hands." Trey glanced back at me. I knew we had no choice but to follow her, even if it meant we were doomed to share the same fate as our friends. "How are you going to find it?" Trey said. Marie didn't respond, just pointed at the ground. I looked and there was a trail of blood, Joel's blood. As we followed Marie in her possessed state of vengeance, I justified risking my life with the knowledge that this thing would hunt us down anyway even if we kept going the way we had been. It was only a matter of time. Maybe going on the offensive would give us a chance of surviving. That's what I told myself to keep me from running the other way, screaming in terror. After a short walk, I noticed the blood trail had diminished. It was farther between now and we had to struggle to find it, but it became a moot point when we stumbled across the cave. It was in a direct line with the last bit of blood we'd seen. It made sense for this thing to hide in a cave. Not that it made me feel any more confident. We stopped about 50 yards away from it and crouched down so we wouldn't be seen as easily. Now what? Trey said. Marie looked around, then picked up a large branch that had fallen. She held it like a club and said, "We kill it." As Trey and I searched for similar weapons, Marie marched straight towards the cave. We caught up with her as she entered the cave. I was expecting it to be dark, but there was some light source further in that I couldn't see yet. Even still, I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on. The cave was nothing special, naturally rough formations of rock on the ceiling and floor. It was large enough for us to stand comfortably, but Trey had to duck in a few places. We stalked our way inside quietly, each of us holding our impromptu clubs at the ready. The further we went, the lighter the cave became. We finally found out why when we came to a roaring fire. There were strips of meat strung across sticks, leaning against each other over the fire. We didn't have to wonder long where the meat had come from. Over in the corner past the fire was a large pile of bones that had been stripped of all meat. I would love to say the bones looked like they came from animals, but they didn't. There was a full human ribcage visible, as well as some femurs and other assorted bones. Some of them were broken, as if the creature had tormented them before killing them. As if the pile of human bones wasn't enough of a horrible discovery, beside them were two bodies. One was unmistakably Joel, but the other was so covered in blood and gore it was hard to identify. My first guess was it could only be Jeannie. Seeing our friends laying on a pile, dead, waiting to be eaten changed something within me. I wasn't afraid anymore. I knew what this thing could do, but I felt the rage building inside me. I knew I would fight to my final breath to make sure this thing never hunted again. As we stood there, I heard a footstep behind us. A half a second later, Trey disappeared in a flash of fur. The creature had snuck up behind us and caught Trey off guard. I watched in horror as it twisted his neck around until his face could see his back. His body collapsed to the ground with a heavy thump. I stared at my friend in shock. He was our best hope of surviving this thing, and now he was gone. Marie screamed like a banshee and charged at it, swinging her club and connecting with its face. The creature turned and looked at her like it hadn't even felt it, then backhanded her, sending her flying against the wall. I charged, holding my club high in hopes to smash its head in. The creature grabbed my club in midair and lifted it up with me still holding on. It shook me loose and I landed on the floor hard, knocking the wind out of me. It squeezed the club with one hand and shattered it. Then it came over to me and stuck its face right next to mine. I could smell the stench of death coming from its mouth. It smiled, showing me its horribly sharp red teeth as I lay there helpless. "Finish it, Soren," I said, through ragged gasps of air. The thing made a sound that sounded almost like a laugh. It stood and glared down at me, still wearing that infuriating grin, and then it began to change. The fur became somehow less and more pink skin appeared. It shrank in size like the reverse of every werewolf movie I've ever seen, until a naked human stood there. It was Jeannie. My jaw hung open. Her grin hadn't changed. It was still as taunting as before. "Why?" I said, still barely able to speak. She snorted like she was still in the beast's form. "You would have the audacity to ask me that," she said. "Do you still not understand? Our friends. No, your friends. I was always the odd one out, the last one called, the outcast, the laughing stock. Included you in everything. Did you really? You didn't want to. I didn't want to have friends that cared about me instead of just using me as a tag-along, an excuse. What happened to Soren?" She walked over to the mangled body covered in blood and kicked it. "He saw me transform," she said. "I was just going to give you all a fright you'd never forget. But then once he saw me, I had no choice. Killed him because he saw you. You don't understand. How could you? This has been passed through generations in my family. It is always regarded as a secret honor of the highest level. No one can know about it. Those unlike us would stop at nothing to hunt us down and destroy us. You deserve it." She smiled, but I knew it wasn't a good thing. She held her hands out and I could see the hair starting to grow on them. I knew this was it. She was done talking. I was about to die. Her face turned from triumph to terror as a piece of broken bone poked out through the middle of her chest. She turned to find Soren shoving it through. He looked like a piece of meat animated. Her transformation became unstable. Her hands grew to enormous size, then shrank back to normal. Her head became covered with hair, then she went bald. She reached back, her bones sounded like they were breaking, and she pulled the bone out of her back. She whipped around and stabbed Soren in the neck with it. The transformation began again when Marie appeared and smashed her face with the club. Jeannie went down hard, smacking her face off the ground with a hollow thud. Marie grabbed the bone and stabbed her in the chest. She pulled the bone back out and stabbed her again. Jeannie screamed as she tried to transform, but Marie's hands were a blur. She stabbed her face, chest, groin, everywhere she could see. She used the sharp end of the bone to impale it. As a last hope for survival, Jeannie reached up and grabbed Marie's neck. She slowly turned it until it was beyond what the vertebrae could take. I heard the first pop and Marie's viscous attack came to a halt. After the second and third, her body went limp and fell over on the floor. Jeannie looked over at me as I finally mustered the strength to stand. I picked up what was left of my club and dragged it over beside her. I could see new patches of fur growing. I raised my club and brought it down on her face. Strength returned to me as I raised the club again, smashing it into her face. Over and over again, I bashed her face until there was nothing left but a bloody pulp. The hair on her body faded as her life ebbed away. I wanted to say something clever and pointed that would make her realize the heinousness of what she'd done, but I was too tired. My adrenaline crashed and I fell to the floor, exhausted. I woke to darkness. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers. I felt around and found my flashlight. I turned it on and stood, looking around the cave. Nothing had changed. Everyone but me was still dead. Even Soren's last desperate act to save us had been at the cost of his life. I shined my light on each body and silently eulogized them. The last one I came to was Jeannie. The only thing I could think was why? Why not tell us? Why keep this thing that burned inside her a secret? I thought about it for a moment and realized I probably wouldn't have told anyone either. I slowly made my way out of the cave. Fortunately, the sun had just risen. I stopped and stared at the wonder of nature. It didn't care that all my friends were dead. It didn't care if I lived or died. The sun would rise again tomorrow no matter what. I suddenly felt very small and insignificant. There was no celebrating. Survival had become a hollow victory. For the longest time, I sat in my car and thought, what do I tell the families of my dead friends? I knew it was a mistake to let Joel lead us. Thank you to my superfans, Sweet Black Swan, Tacy, and Brooklyn. I really appreciate you guys supporting my channel, and I look forward to making more content for everyone.